let me begin with two questions. One more of a point, I guess, and then a question. You said earlier that these crises are supposed to be rare, although another reading of it is that actually the one of the constant rhetorical tropes that we heard in response to the crisis is well, we always have bubbles and they burst. It's not a rare event. In fact, a lot of economists and defenders of the system defend it against people who say, we have to worry about it because of these crises, by saying this is just part of capitalism, right? John Stuart Mill wrote when he wrote after some of the bubbles, saying this is just part of what capitalism is. It's about creating speculative bubbles. We expect it to, at some point, speculation to lead to excesses, and then it has to work itself out. That's not an argument against paper money, as he was arguing at the time, or against cheap money, or against capitalism itself. The point he argued is that over the long term, it would create efficiencies, and we just have to accept the fact that there's going to be bubbles and speculations. And so another approach would be to say it's not that these are more common than people think. It's actually that they are common, but we need to actually take into account and ask, do we want a system based upon that sort of normalizes bubbles, right? Which is what we've gotten. And so just to point that out and see if that matters to you in your reading. I'd love you to talk a little bit more about the ways in which globalization shrinks political space, something you've said a couple times. You said it fills the space and it hoards a vacuum. I think you have something very particular in mind, and I'd like you to sort of give some examples and flesh that out, if you could. So, two things to reflect on or speak to, if that works.
Well, I'm taking the idea of shrinking the political space from a political economist named Robert Wade, who's talking very, very narrowly and specifically about what he calls the development space, which is the policy choices available to developing countries, the development models which were deemed acceptable by funders and patron governments seem to have just been culled, right, in the most extraordinary fashion during the 80s and 90s, right? And that's a standard neoliberal story. I take
what do you mean culled?
Well, there are fewer avenues for development that are seen as legitimate now. If you want to get money from the World Bank or the IMF, or indeed meet certain criteria for U.S. aid. There's an American style neoliberal model which serves as a kind of economic orthodoxy, which privileges export-led growth over import substitution, for example, right? Which is hostile towards welfare states, right, and which is hostile towards certain patterns of traditional ownership and certain conceptions of property and so on. There's a long story to be told there about the emergence of neoliberalism as a kind of economic orthodoxy. I take that to be sort of almost by now a commonplace, right? It's a commonplace that seems to me to be reifying the very thing that it's critiquing. In other words, left critiques of neoliberalism seem to be overlooking the real world of capitalist variety in a way. It simply isn't true that because of U.S. hegemony, the capitalist world has morphed into the United States. There's still a great deal of economic forms, capitalist forms, that are just simply very different, right?
The emergence of China is the primary example of this. State sponsor. There have just been numerous articles recently about the fact that the newfound legitimacy of currency manipulation in recent times, which comes out of the Chinese model, is actually threatening the United States and
Yeah.
and its commitment to, claimed commitment to free currency.
Yeah, and these are in some sense capitalisms that dare not speak their name, right? So the German model, the Swedish model, what China's doing, they're under theorized and sort of underrepresented within a certain range of public discourse on political economy.
I mean, I guess that was the second question. I didn't know whether you were taking names.
No, go ahead.
Well,
It's an open conversation.
okay. I guess that, I find your analysis, quite frighteningly persuasive, but I guess a little bit like Roger, but perhaps from a different direction, I'd be curious to know more about the social content of these processes, and especially, one of the features of the 21st century is, of course, that even in whatever kind of perverted form, there is no such thing as socialism as a competition, nor is there internal to the polities the kind of organized resistance that took, to pardon the expression, class form, or that organized labor doesn't exist as a force anywhere, declining in Europe, Sweden, all the models,
Right.
which really in important measure depend on that political force, however problematic it is in its own right. The trend is very, very abruptly and clearly downhill. In this country, of course, to say union is to speak only of teachers' unions who destroy education, or public employers, librarians' unions that have to be cleaned out because they raise the taxes on localities. And so the whole concept of a labor organization, or organized labor, which plays such an important part in the thinking about democracy in the 20th century, but not for Hannah Arendt, which then raises an interesting issue, I think, is to what extent that absence of a socially organized resistance factor or qualifying factor is part of, in the first place, the presence of it is part of the explanation for your diversities, even in some bizarre form in China, that is the overcoming, the post-socialist history of China.
Yeah.
And so I think that should, perhaps I'd be interested to know how you've put that in the analysis, or whether you have an agenda to look into that issue, or that complex of issues.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and I wish I had more profound things to say about it. What I'm after is a renewed critique of capitalism, or a renewed anti-capitalism, right? So something like democratic socialism is way down the road, the name of the game for me here theoretically, but I don't really know what that is, and I'm rather dissatisfied, with the available theoretical statements of it, right? So I also have a sense that precisely those questions have been off the table in a certain way in social science and in the humanities, which I found frustrating. So someone like me comes along and tries to, raise the question of capitalism again. There's a question of intellectual division of labor here, which sort of kills the project before it gets off the ground. What do you mean? What is your theory of global capitalism? Well, then I say, I have no idea. Right? I don't know how it works. My wish for this project has been something like a more constructed dialogue between political theory and political economy, and from there, I would hope that something radiates out from that reconstructs a critical approach to capitalism. But that's a long way off.
Is it a return to social democracy? You're saying what's the new thing, but down the road it's social democracy. Is it, a recommitment to social democracy, or why are you running from that? Let's ask that question point blank.
Yeah, two reasons, right? At my most deeply, I think that both social democracy and Stalinism failed to overcome capitalism, right? So I don't regard them as anti-capitalism's root and branch. I regard them as more or less successful, more or less admirable attempts to overcome it that didn't quite work. So if it turns out that capitalism can take a wide diversity of forms, then the project becomes, what do all those forms have in common? And one of those forms, one way that one shape it takes is 5-year plans, and another shape it takes is social democratic welfare states.
I've recently been struck by the proliferation of capitalisms, some of which are very small scale, of course, which represent new ways of thinking about how the model might operate, multiply. And it seems to me sort of more creatively considered than once again going over as you say, the now familiar critique of neoliberalism. So in a way, you might be just the person to fill in the need to elaborate a spirit of critical capitalism by taking into account this proliferation of forms and thinking about comparative advantages and different, moving in at the origin stage, if you will, of capitalisms that might be more sympathetic to the values that you embrace. But it seems to me that in a way, since the critique of neoliberalism is pretty much well established by now, it might, in your balance and your thinking about your work, you could start from a new beginning, which is, okay, now what is all of this going on, and how could it make something of this goal of a kind of healthy criticality? I was recently reading about American business, internet business people in America who were going through a great deal of trouble to provide not only to supply the resources for women in developing countries to make the goods which were then going to be redistributed in America, all of which made the goods more expensive. But it struck me as an inversion of another kind of model. But that's what I mean by there are various kinds of capitalisms going on now which redefine or question or interrogate what the relationship is between dominant and subordinate, and even where we might train our own workers to go in the absence of other more productively guaranteed futures. So I wondered if, how you would respond to that. I mean, is it possible to take, as your starting point, a sort of, okay, here's where we are now, and this is what an inventory of these possibilities would look like?
Yeah, it's precisely that kind of departure that I've been trying to get off the ground with mixed success, right?
Right.
And so when I share this work, I tend to get folded in as a neo-Marxist or a critic of neoliberalism or something like that, and that's not far from the truth, but it's not exactly there, right? So one part of this project is an engagement with the whole idea of comparative advantage, right? Which is a technically controversial theory that is the only justification for free trade, right? So the only reason why we have free trade as opposed to protectionism is because of this doctrine, which we get from Ricardo, and which becomes ever more baroque and technically exotic the more you go into it. Paul Krugman's Nobel Prize-winning work was an attempt to sort of clean up this theory from one of its major embarrassments. One of the major embarrassments was that the theory of comparative advantage, which drives globalization, doesn't allow for capital mobility. If you introduce capital mobility into the theory, it doesn't work. The math doesn't add up, right? The assumptions of the model just break down. I take a great deal of sort of interest in sort of theoretical embarrassments of microeconomics, right? Which is in a way it's sort of like taking pot shots at it. It's not like I have an alternative, but yeah, I mean, I think comparative advantage is sort of rich with those embarrassments. And someone like Krugman, to his credit, is actually pretty candid about them. So I mean, that was one feature of it. The very notion of comparative advantage depends upon a certain set of teleological, ontological, metaphysical assumptions about the very idea of national space. and the which are Aristotelian through and through. So anyway, but yeah.
Right.
Attacking the idea of comparative advantage as sort of the abstract logic of capitalism has been one way I've been trying to go with this.
I have a bunch of questions about reality and the slide away from it that are really all different ways of asking you to return to the question that Roger asked about filling out a bit more about what your non-expansionist theory of political space is or offers, because it sounds like it has something to offer, but you didn't have the time to really offer it as an alternative. So questions about reality. So first, if globalization is best conceived as a kind of totalitarianism, which is to say a slide towards unreality, and you've given these examples of things like unemployment as the new norm, as the slide away from reality. Is it the reality that's sliding, or is it our ability to grasp the reality that's sliding? Like, is it that the world itself has changed, and that there's some other world that you would want to call real, and this world actually is unreal? Or is this a world? Worlds are hard to grasp. They require different kinds of both political and conceptual resources, and that something's happened that makes it impossible for us to grasp it. Maybe those two go hand in hand. Maybe there's a new world that we haven't yet caught up to in our thinking, which would make a lot of sense if you're going to Arendt on totalitarianism, because I think she's there thinking about what does it mean to think in the absence of a concept about an event that we can't comprehend if we just sort of liken it to things that are familiar. Familiar reality is no more. So that leads into maybe a second question / comment on reality, which is what is it that you get out of, and what is it maybe that you can't get out of comparing globalization to something like totalitarianism, or at one point you said it's imperialism repurposed. Are you not, in some sense, falling into that trap of trying to comprehend a reality that seems unreal because we don't have a way to think about it yet, by thinking about it through old concepts, right? Like, don't we need some kind of new way of thinking about globalization, and what would that be? Maybe it is this non-expansionist theory of political space. Another semi-related question is whether this irreality is the product of the work of agents of globalization, or is globalization itself kind of an entity? You tend to personify it a lot. Is what you're talking about when you talk about irreality the problem of propaganda? And if it is it in its familiar form or in some unfamiliar form? Because certainly propaganda can foreclose our access to sort of sense of realness, Arendt would call it, but maybe there's something different going on here. And then finally, you started with this great metaphor for...
It's fun to see him answer.
What?
It'll be fun to see him answer this.
Well, like I said, pick any or none of these, and basically just answer Roger's question. But the final one is just that, you started with this great metaphor for, a way of thinking about reality, which is that nature abhors a vacuum. There's a description of reality, and you're saying it doesn't quite work with globalization. So maybe as a way of finding a synonym for non-expansionist theory of political space, there might be another kind of physics that you could talk about. I mean, among other things, we've got bubbles going on, and bubbles give you a very different picture of air pressure, let's say, than a vacuum. I mean, in a vacuum, you have to have solid walls and then pump all the air out of it, and of course you never can because nature abhors a vacuum. But a bubble doesn't have those solid walls. It keeps growing and growing. So of course you can't think about globalization as something that just sort of uniformly fills space as soon as you have a bubble. Instead, you have a reality that's more leavened and explosive. So, since maybe I gave you enough there.
Okay. All right.
Physics 101.
So instead of picking just one, I'll say brief. I'll give brief commercials about the rest of the project on each of those points. Where is my physics? The last point first, and the dissertation project from which this is drawn. I don't think it's going to continue in this direction, but the original project was to think about Epicurean physics, Lucretius physics, as an alternative model of ontology to something like either Aristotelian teleological organicism or something like mechanics, right? So that introduces a whole different range of thought about causality and whether or not nature has whether or not nature affords a vacuum, or whether there is indeed, as Lucretius says, a void in things, right? And I say there's a void in things, right? That means there's a void in capitalism. There's a kind of element of chanciness, of stochastic events that left political economy especially doesn't like to confront, hung up as it is frequently on dialectics, right? So that's my globalization is sometimes, I don't just personify it metaphorically. I think it's an agent out there in the world. It's a collection of material stuff. It's a state of physical affairs that does things. And so I think we can talk intelligently about global capitalism's playing a role, as they say, in global warming, right? That collection of stuff is doing things. So that's not to sort of make it an evil villain. It's rather banally a bunch of dumb, non-human stuff that's out there objectively in the world somehow, right? Okay, so scale. I mean, I think that what do I think about political knowledge? What do I think about knowledge anyway? What's my epistemology? I do what I want to pursue to some degree is Arendt's insight that there's a certain scale that's appropriate to common sense and to political judgment, and that she's drawing on Thucydides here. Empires are bad for common sense in some sense, in precisely that sense, and that's. I think that's valuable and true and worthy of thinking about in terms of globalization. And in terms of what I think is real and what's not, elsewhere in the project I take up Marx's idea of abstract time, which is his attempt to sort of refuse the analytic synthetic dichotomy in thinking about value. And I'll leave that as a cryptic commercial for future discussions.
Yeah, I guess this relates to the idea of globalization as its own entity, or globalization as like propaganda. And in the Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt talks about ideology and ideology behind movements. And I was wondering if you thought that there's sort of an ideology behind behind globalization, and whether or not, like, how that relates to capitalism.
Yeah, no, I think that's, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think globalization is an ideology. I wish I knew what ideology meant, right? I think it's very hard for me to figure out what's ideology and what's not. I don't like the idea, sort of a Marxist idea that says that ideology is false consciousness, because it seems to suggest that there's a true consciousness behind the real, right? Behind the illusion. And of course, I don't know what that true consciousness is, and I don't know what the appropriate standpoint for critiquing globalization is. And of course, I'm caught up in the process myself, so I have no idea. I wish we had a better theory of ideology.
Let's take Arendt's definition, right? Which is that it's a claim that a single idea is the key to explaining everything. For which reason she says that ideology necessarily only emerges in this age of science, because it's a universal explanation of the world according to a single idea. I'm sure there's other ideas of ideology, but this is hers, right? I mean, and you can say, no, that's not the one I want.
But God,
David can contest it. But
religion.
But then, if you were to take that, what would be the sort of single overriding claim of globalization, and is there a science of globalization in that sense? Is there way in which globalization makes an overriding claim, neoliberalist claim, I take it by your reading, to explain everything or not.
I think sometimes in some places there's a monism, right, to globalization ideology, right? I think that makes sense. I worry because I think part of what drives all kinds of social processes, including globalization, is precisely ideological diversity and conflict. So I want to beg off Arendt's definition of ideology as being necessarily monistic fanaticism or something like that. It works well for the Nazis, right? But it doesn't work well, for say macroeconomics in the United States right now. I don't think.
I mean, there's so many questions on the table, but I assume that they're going to be on your agenda, and we'll come back and hear more about it. So I don't know if I dare raise other new issues, but I mean, I think that one variable, go back since we were sort of flirting around the edges, Marx or post-Marx, or a little bit, and I mentioned classes, but I think that the rather un-Marxist notion of maldistributions. I mean, it seems to me that one of the very basic phenomena, the dualization of economies, I mean, the term was used in the 70s and 80s, and then they kind of people argued about it. But now there's really nothing much to argue about. I mean, I guess yesterday, or this morning's Times had again the current analysis of the census returns is the widest gap ever, and not even thinking about global. And so the question about the role of resources and access to resources as a constituent of any kind of political life, first speak of money and then speak right or wrong, Brecht, I got it wrong, and then first speak of bread. Anyway, so I think that the question whether one needn't separately to also thematize the distribution question and the maldistribution question as a key element in in trying to imagine whether micropolitics or cross politics. The other question, the other question is one that you mentioned in passing, or a theme that you mentioned in passing. When I taught the first course here on globalization, and it was all about NGOs and cosmopolitanism and democratization and so on, what was in the textbooks and in the books that used the term that was available with the political economy, some way referring back to the beginning of the 20th century, sort of a continuity with that. But the most interesting thing to people was the cosmopolitan promise and implication. In fact, I'm just reading a book about how sports are, fueling a new cosmopolitanism by someone, a very interesting guy, who I hope will come here, who's a kind of Arendt guy too. So I wonder if you never mentioned that, except in passing at the beginning when you sort of said, well, here's this kind of idealized view of globalization and it looks towards a new opportunities for democracy and so on, but then you didn't pass over it. So what do you make of all that, human rights and a whole bunch of other stuff that's ostensibly also a function of globalization in this other, given the paradoxical character, the concept of a cosmopolis, not only Arendt but Aristotle would be pretty amazed by that notion that you could have a cosmopolis.
Yeah.
But, what do you do with cosmopolitanism, or is it simply that it's too weak to even wrestle with?
No, I punt on the question. Basically, is that's sort of the fast answer to it. But no, it's an important question. One source of cosmopolitan thinking that I'm exploring